For most of its existence, the monarchy sold a single product: purity of blood. The paperwork rarely cooperated. Court genealogists in Florence, Zanzibar, Honolulu, and Bangkok tracked who fathered whom with obsessive care, and those same records kept producing heirs whose mothers reached the palace as war captives, as purchases at market, or as servants hired to sweep floors in rooms they would later fill with princes. Before we start, a warning about the word biracial. Race is not a measurement. It is a category that shifts by century and by border, and dragging it backwards onto people who never encountered the concept produces strange results. A Moor in early modern Europe might mean a black African, an Arab, or any Muslim at all, depending on who held the pen and how annoyed that person felt. In Islamic courts, and across much of Asia, lineage traveled through the father and stopped there. So a child born to an enslaved foreign concubine, an al-Walad, ranked exactly level with a child born to a free wife. Several people in this video would never have called themselves biracial, and some would not even grasp the question. We apply the label backwards, and wherever it draws a fight, we will say so. So, a Duke of Florence whose enemies called him a bastard and a Moor in the same breath, and who lasted 5 years on the throne before an assassin found him. Down the coast of East Africa, a princess of Zanzibar abandons the harem, converts to Christianity, marries a German merchant, and then publishes the family secrets in a book. One Siamese prince proved so inconvenient to the crown that the kingdom rewrote its succession law to guarantee he could never inherit. Then, the Hawaiian crown princess, who sailed to Washington to lobby the American president. And a Saudi prince, born to an enslaved concubine and raised far from the palaces, who talked his way into 2 decades as his kingdom's ambassador in Washington. 11 royals, 11 households where the official story about blood ran straight into the question of who actually shared a bed with whom. Arranged here in rough order of arrival, rather than by how loudly the argument still rages. Let's meet them. Born in 1510 into the most powerful family in Italy, Alessandro de Medici carried a paternity nobody has ever settled. The official version names Lorenzo II de Medici, Duke of Urbino. A sizable body of evidence points somewhere else entirely, at Giulio de Medici, the cousin who would later put on the papal tiara as Clement VII, which would leave the first hereditary Duke of Florence as the biological son of a pope. His mother drew less confusion and considerably more contempt: Simonetta da Collavecchio, a domestic servant in the Medici household. The case for African ancestry rests on 2 things: what contemporaries wrote about Simonetta and what Alessandro looked like. Diplomatic dispatches and private letters call her a Mora, a Moor, and in some accounts a peasant of African descent. Then there is the face. Agnolo Bronzino painted the Duke with a set of traits that modern scholars frequently read as African, and the portrait sits alongside the nickname that trailed him through his short life: Il Moro, the Moor. Historians have not reached agreement, and pretending otherwise would amount to dishonesty. Catherine Fletcher and John K. Brackett both argue for his biracial status, pointing to the documented presence of enslaved Africans across Renaissance Italy as the context that renders the claim entirely plausible. A number of Italian scholars push back hard. Their counter-argument runs that Simonetta came from the village of Collavecchio as an Italian peasant, full stop, and that Il Moro described nothing more exotic than a dark Mediterranean complexion, a nickname so ordinary in early modern Italy that it barely worked as a description at all, which leaves the confidence rating at medium, and medium is the honest answer. The primary sources hold up. The modern reading of them resembles a knife fight between serious scholars, and anyone who tells you the case is closed in either direction is selling something. What his contemporaries believed matters more here than what a genetic test might turn up. Florentine Republicans in exile loathed Medici autocracy, and they reached for his mother constantly, her servant status, her alleged foreign blood. The whole package repackaged as proof that a bastard tyrant now occupied the seat where a free city once governed itself. Racial contempt and class contempt worked as a single weapon. That campaign of vitriol ran the length of his rule, from 1532 until an assassin ended it in 1537. He held Florence for 5 years. The argument about his mother has outlived him by nearly 5 centuries. Sayyida Salme arrived in 1844 as a daughter of the Al Said dynasty, child of Said bin Sultan, who ruled Muscat, Oman, and Zanzibar, and kept a household resembling a map of Indian Ocean trade more than anything a European court would recognize. Her mother, Jilfadan, came from the Caucasus. Circassian, enslaved, captured, and delivered to the Zanzibar court, where she bore a princess who would eventually explain the entire arrangement to a European reading public in print. The evidence here ranks about as strong as historical evidence ever comes. Salme wrote it down herself in Memoirs of an Arabian Princess from Zanzibar, which appeared in 1888 as one of the first known autobiographies by an Arab woman, and reads throughout like a woman settling accounts. She catalogued the harem in detail: which concubine came from where, which sibling claimed an African mother, which a Circassian one, which traced back to Asia. Nobody reconstructed her ancestry from portraiture or diplomatic gossip, because the princess published the ledger herself. Islamic patrilineal law counted her a fully legitimate princess, equal in standing to any daughter born to a free Arab wife, and her mother's status as al-Walad locked that legitimacy in place. The law took one position, and palace society took another. His own account describes intense colorism inside those walls, with pure-blooded Arab royals looking down on their Afro-Arab and Euro-Arab half-siblings. Precisely the sort of detail only an insider would bother recording, and only an exile would dare publish. Then she left. Salme fled Zanzibar, converted to Christianity, married a German merchant, and spent the rest of her life in Europe under a new name, Emily Ruet, the name printed on the spine. She lived until 1924 and reached 80, working the whole time as a cultural go-between for the Arab world and Imperial Germany, and leaving historians the best interior account of a 19th century Zanzibari court anyone possesses. Keep that ledger in mind. We will come back to it, because one of her half-brothers turns up later on this list, and nearly everything anyone knows about his mother comes from Salme's pen. Emma Kalanikauma Kaamano Kaleleonala ni Naea Ruk, born in 1836, married into the House of Kamehameha as consort to Kamehameha IV. High Chief George Naya, her father, belonged to the native Hawaiian nobility. Her mother, Fanny Kekelauokalani Young, carried both Hawaiian and British ancestry, which entered the family through Fanny's father, John Young, a British sailor who ended up in the islands. Rose to trusted military advisor to Kamehameha I, and assimilated so completely into the Hawaiian elite that his granddaughter finished as a queen. Nobody needs to guess at any of this. The Hawaiian kingdom maintained genealogical records, the Quauhau, with a precision European courts would have envied, because ali'i rank and succession rights depended on getting them right. State archives, royal family journals, and contemporary census data all track her British and Hawaiian lines. Documentation on that scale remains rare for the 19th century, and rarer still for a Pacific monarchy Americans would shortly dismiss as primitive. The court she married into looked outward by habit. Her husband traveled to the United States, England, and France as a young prince and kept a journal of the voyage that survives in print, so the monarchy Emma joined already understood precisely how it appeared to foreign powers and how much that appearance would cost or save them. Emma grasped the calculation better than most. Her ancestry never functioned as a scandal, and she worked it as a tool. Native Hawaiians respected her as a high-ranking ali'i, and she leaned into the British half of her family with real enthusiasm, becoming a committed Anglophile who used her grandfather's origins to build ties with Great Britain as a counterweight to American ambition in the Pacific. Her campaign to establish the Anglican Church in Hawaii came out of the same calculation. She died in 1885, and the annexationists she spent a career trying to outflank seized the kingdom 8 years later. Johanna Marau Ta'aroa, a Tepau Salmon, arrived in 1860, and her parents form a strange pairing on paper. Her father, Alexander Salmon, an English Jewish merchant out of London, settled in Tahiti. Princess Oehow, her mother, better known as Ari'i Taimai, held supreme chiefly authority over the Teva clan, one of the strongest political blocs on the island. Marau married King Pomare V and became queen consort of the Pomare dynasty. French colonial registries logged the births and marriages, and Tahitian royal genealogies preserved the chiefly descent. Marau handled the rest herself. Her Memoirs de la Reine, Marau Taaroa, L'Histoire de Tahiti, set out her mother's indigenous lineage and her father's European Jewish origins in her own words, though the book did not reach print until 1971, decades after her death. The book's late arrival matters. A queen's own account of Tahitian history sat unpublished while French administrators produced their version of the same events, and by the time hers reached readers, the monarchy it described lay 90 years in the past. Mixed heritage translated directly into money and diplomatic reach for the Salmon family, which explains precisely why the royal marriage happened. Tahitian chiefly authority sat on one side, European commercial networks on the other, and a French colonial administration circled the island with obvious intent. Both the Tahitian elite and the French administrators read Marau as a formidable operator who moved between the two worlds fluently and used that position to argue for her people. France annexed the monarchy in 1880. Marau kept working in the same rooms for another 54 years, dying in 1934. Prince Chula Chakrabongse arrived in 1908 inside the Chakri dynasty of Siam, and his existence created a constitutional problem that outlasted him. His father, Prince Chakrabongse Bhuvanath, ranked among the prominent sons of King Chulalongkorn, Rama V. Ekaterina Desnitskaya, his mother, came from Russian nobility. The two of them met while the prince trained as a military officer in Imperial Russia, and they married in secret without asking permission from anyone in Bangkok. Siamese royal archives and Russian state records both hold the paper trail, including the furious correspondence between King Chulalongkorn and the son who married a foreigner behind his back. Chula added his own account later. Brought up in England, published in 1943, works through his dual heritage and its consequences at exhaustive length, which suggests a man who thought about the subject rather more than he wanted to. Here the comparison with Zanzibar does real work. An Omani sultan could father children of enslaved Ethiopian and Circassian women while the law barely blinked, because descent ran through him alone. Siam took the opposite view. King Chulalongkorn initially refused to recognize the marriage or the half-Russian grandson it produced, treating European ancestry as contamination rather than as an alliance worth keeping. The formal response arrived in 1924 in legislation. King Vajiravud, Rama VI, promulgated a palace law of succession, barring any prince born to a foreign mother from inheriting the throne, which removed Chula from the line of succession on the basis of nothing whatsoever except his mother's nationality. Laws that exclude a category of person usually keep one particular person in mind. Chula died in 1963, a prince of the blood legislated out of the only thing the blood ever existed for. Barghash bin Sayyid arrived in 1837 as another son of Sayyid bin Sultan, and he took the throne of Zanzibar in 1870. His mother came to the court as an enslaved Ethiopian concubine. Official state records never bothered themselves to preserve her name, which tells you a great deal about the record keepers, and nothing about her, though people who knew that court from the inside documented her ethnic and geographic origins perfectly well. That documentation comes, as promised, from his half-sister. Salme's memoirs catalog the maternal origins of her many siblings and identify Barghash's mother as an Abyssinian al-Walad, which leaves a runaway princess writing in Europe as the primary authority on the parentage of a reigning Zanzibari sultan. Set that against Siam. Chula Chakrabongse lost a throne because his mother came from Russian nobility, while Barghash gained one despite a mother carried out of Ethiopia in chains, and the gap between those two outcomes owes nothing whatsoever to how much African or European ancestry either man carried. It comes down to which legal system happened to do the counting. Islamic jurisprudence and Omani dynastic custom handed Barghash complete legitimacy. His father ranked as an Arab prince, so he ranked as an Arab prince, and the enslaved foreign status of his mother carried no legal weight against his right to rule. Social reality ran on a separate track. Court factions and pure-blooded Arab aristocrats raised the African ancestry of royals like Barghash, whenever it suited them, in whispers rather than in statute, which is how colorism tends to operate in societies whose formal rules forbid it outright. He ruled for 18 years and died in 1888. Sultan of Zanzibar, unimpeachably legitimate, and still gossiped about. Norodom Sihamoni, born in 1953, currently occupies the throne of Cambodia. His father, King Norodom Sihanouk, ran a political career and a marital history of comparable length and complication. Queen Mother Norodom Monineth, his mother, born Paule Monique Itzi, carries French, Italian, and Cambodian ancestry. Her own father, a French banker of Italian descent, her mother, Cambodian. None of this requires investigative work. Royal palace biographies state it plainly, and mainstream scholarship on Sihanouk's marriages and the Cambodian royal family covers identical ground. A living head of state with a documented European grandparent leaves very little room for the sort of portrait squinting that keeps the Alessandro de Medici argument alive after 500 years. His Eurasian ancestry disappeared almost entirely behind what he actually spent his life doing. Khmer Rouge-era politics pushed him abroad, and he passed decades in Prague and Paris working as a ballet instructor and cultural ambassador, which does not describe the standard resume for a monarch. Classical dance, Theravada Buddhism, the traditional Khmer arts. That forms the public identity, and Cambodians recognize it. When the Royal Council of the Throne selected him in 2004, his mixed parentage and European upbringing counted in his favor rather than against it, because between them they produced a candidate who came across as neutral, internationally fluent, and unattached to the partisan wreckage of late 20th century Cambodian politics. Wanting a king with no domestic enemies, the kingdom crowned a ballet teacher. Rachel Meghan Markle, born in 1981, married into the House of Windsor in 2018. Her father, Thomas Markle, is a white American of European descent, and her mother, Doria Ragland, is African American. Establishing the genealogy takes about 4 seconds. That simplicity has not prevented the subject from generating more published commentary than the parentage of every other person on this list combined, and probably more than all of them put together twice over. Civil registries and marriage records cover the formal side. She addressed the question directly in print years before most of Britain knew her name, writing for Elle in 2015 and setting out the arithmetic herself: a Caucasian father, an African-American mother, and a daughter who belongs to both categories at once. That essay predates the engagement, the wedding, the departure, and the entire industry of speculation attached to all of it. A great many cultural commentators read the 2018 marriage to Prince Harry as a watershed for an institution that spent centuries marrying inside a very small pool. What arrived instead? Tabloid coverage a large body of academic work now describes as racially coded. Her departure from working royal duties turned the whole business into a running argument about institutional racism, British colonial history, and the way the modern press treats biracial women in public life. That argument continues. Whatever position you hold on it, the sheer volume of scholarship produced by one woman's ancestry counts as a fact worth noting. And so does the detail that nobody wrote peer-reviewed papers about Princess Angela of Liechtenstein, who reached the same milestone 18 years earlier. Victoria Kaweku Kalaninu Ayahi Lapalapa Kaiulani Cleghorn arrived in 1875 and grew up as heir apparent to the throne of Hawaii. Her father, Archibald Scott Cleghorn, worked as a Scottish financier in the islands. Princess Miriam Laiklaik, her mother and a native Hawaiian noble, counted King Kalakaua and Queen Liliuokalani among her siblings, which placed Kaiulani about as close to the center of the House of Kalakaua as anyone could stand. Hawaiian government birth registers and royal genealogies documented her lineage from the beginning, and the press in Honolulu, San Francisco, and London tracked her existence with an appetite. Modern celebrity coverage would recognize instantly. She achieved fame before adulthood. Newspapers on 3 continents printed opinions about the blood in her veins, and none of them asked her first. Inside Hawaii, that ancestry turned her into the hope of the nation, a princess with a Western education who could defend Hawaiian sovereignty in the language of the people trying to take it. Outside Hawaii, the same ancestry turned her into a target. American pro-annexation newspapers ran her heritage in whichever direction the argument required that week. Her Scottish blood proved she might yet turn civilized. Her Hawaiian blood proved her unfit to govern anything at all. Racist logic rarely bothers with consistency. The monarchy fell in 1893. Ka'iulani, fluent in both cultures and entirely aware of what that fluency counted for, traveled to Washington, D.C. to lobby President Grover Cleveland in person on behalf of her people, which meant a teenage princess walking into the capital of the country, dismantling her kingdom and arguing the case herself, in English, to the man at the top. She died in 1899, 6 years after the overthrow, never having taken the throne that shaped her entire upbringing. Angela Gisela Brown arrived in 1958 in Bocas del Toro, Panama, daughter of Javier Francisco Brown and Sylvia Maritza Burke, and grew up in New York. She is of Afro-Panamanian descent. In January 2000, she married Prince Maximilian of Liechtenstein, and by doing so introduced African ancestry into a reigning European princely family for the first time in the modern era. Civil and religious marriage records in New York and Vaduz document the union, and her formal entry into the genealogis's Handbuch des Adels, the reference work European nobility treats as its register of record, settles her standing past argument. Genealogists agree. No contested version of this story exists. No squinting at portraits. No 15-generation chain of inference stretching back to a medieval mistress. Genealogists and the international press both describe her as the first person of known African descent to marry into a reigning European royal family in the modern era. That claim comes narrowly and carefully worded, and it holds up. Her name in the genealogis's handbook records a shift in who European nobility marries, printed in the same dry typeface the volume uses for every other entry. Prince Hans Adam II approved the marriage, and the House of Liechtenstein absorbed the new princess without visible drama. Elsewhere in the European aristocracy, the reaction ran cooler, since centuries of deliberately endogamous marriage produced families that looked the way they look entirely on purpose, and a Panamanian-American bride in Vaduz departed from that arrangement in a way nobody could pretend to miss. The press covered it as a milestone. Liechtenstein covered it as a wedding. Bandar bin Sultan Al Saud arrived in 1949, son of Crown Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz, the Saudi defense minister, and of a woman named Hiziran, an enslaved concubine from the Asir province with Ethiopian ancestry. One parent belonged to the most powerful ruling family on the Arabian Peninsula. The other held no standing at all. The Saudi royal hierarchy in that period sorted children by their mothers, and Bandar landed near the bottom of the list. Nobody hid the arithmetic. He and Khiziran lived apart from the main palaces through his early years, outside the circle of princes born to politically connected wives, and his darker complexion, together with his mother's history of servitude, counted against him in a court that kept careful score of such things. Bandar has discussed that isolation himself in interviews, and the major biographies of the Saudi royal family document it in detail. Bandar dismantled that starting position entirely. A military education turned into political access, and access turned into a career as one of the most powerful diplomats of the late 20th century, capped by more than 2 decades as Saudi ambassador to the United States. The boy kept away from the palaces ended as the kingdom's voice in Washington, the kind of reversal that stratified royal courts never plan for and never entirely forgive. Every list like this one attracts the same objections, so let's handle them. Queen Charlotte, consort of George III, collects the label Britain's first black queen, with some regularity. And the claim traces to a 1997 theory by the historian Mario de Valdez y Cocom, who argued that her appearance in certain portraits pointed to African ancestry inherited from Madragana, a 13th century Moorish mistress of King Alfonso III of Portugal. Mainstream historians and genealogists reject it flatly. 15 generations of distance render any genetic inheritance statistically negligible, and the word Moor in 13th century Iberia never reliably meant a black African in the first place. The theory survives in popular media because it tells a better story than the evidence can support. Louise Marie Thérèse, the Black Nun of Moret, presents a more interesting problem. A black Benedictine nun did live in 17th century France and did receive unusual patronage from the royal household, and a persistent rumor held that she came into the world as the illegitimate biracial daughter of Queen Marie Thérèse, wife of Louis XIV, fathered by an enslaved African page. The nun existed. Her parentage remains a mystery historians still argue over. Nobody at the time recognized her as royal, and that failure of the definitional test explains why she sits in this section instead of among the main 11. Cleopatra VII comes up constantly. Ptolemaic lineage ran primarily Macedonian Greek, with some Persian ancestry, and no documented evidence supports a black African mother, which renders her inclusion on lists like this one an anachronism rather than a discovery. Philippa of Hainaut, consort of Edward III, drew the description brown in a single medieval chronicle, and genealogists have since attributed that word to a brunette complexion rather than to African origin. Tariq bin Ziyad carried a mixed Berber and Arab background and a formidable military career, yet he commanded armies and governed territory without ever ruling as a monarch or belonging to a royal house by birth or marriage, which puts him outside the definition this list runs on. What connects all 11 of the confirmed cases is how badly the ideology of pure blood matched the household arrangements that actually produced heirs. Sultans fathered legitimate princes on enslaved Ethiopian and Circassian women, while the law barely registered it. Siam wrote a statute to keep a Russian mother's son off the throne. Florence assassinated a duke whose mother served in the Medici household, and 500 years later, historians still argue about her skin. Purity of blood never described anything. It amounted to a claim, repeated for centuries by dynasties, whose own record keepers carried on carefully writing down the names of Circassian concubines, Ethiopian mothers, Scottish sailors, and Russian noblewomen, one legitimate heir at a time. If you want these stories at greater length, the companion podcast digs into several of them properly. Leave a like if the video earned one, subscribe if you plan on sticking around, and drop your own additions in the comments. Because far more of these cases exist than 11, and some of you will know the ones we missed. Thanks for watching.